John Jeffries and his wife Jen run 4,500 hectares on the southern Monero on the New South Wales Victorian border. They run 1,000 head of cattle, they run 15,000 breeding ewes, and they turn off anywhere between 25 and 30,000 lambs with some trade on top of that. John's been doing amazing work improving his pastures, capturing carbon, building soil fertility, looking after the environment, looking after the water supply. John's got some concerns about the new carbon trading schemes and their impact on farmers, and he'd like to see a bit of discussion around this. I caught up with John today to find out more. When you've got a tranche of money, you've got this big bucket of money, people are going to find interesting and unusual ways to access it, aren't they?
They certainly have, and they seem to have done it.
John, thanks very much for having us out today, mate.
Okay.
Absolute pleasure to be out here with you in this beautiful paddock here. You're involved in some fairly complex and fairly interesting programs, aren't you?
Yeah, well, they're emerging that way, of course, Tim. We've always supplied just into the open market, of course, but now we're into some branding type programs in terms of lamb, and we've also got a new one coming up this coming season in terms of canola as well. So that's partly about carbon, but it's also about the other added value in terms of environmental values as well on top of carbon.
Now you supply lamb into Willow Bend, and there's fairly significant environmental requirements for being able to supply into those sort of markets, aren't there?
Yeah, for sure. And we've got a couple of things, as I alluded to there previously, in terms of carbon and biodiversity and those other elements. But on the initial work we've done in terms of carbon intensity and the like, it's basically comes down to efficiency. So the more efficient we're turning this sort of pasture into kilos of lamb, that essentially decreases your carbon intensity. So and luckily we've been focusing on that for a while before we realised about any of this sort of carbon talk, but essentially that lowers your number. So if we continue to focus on that, that's a good thing. But they're also starting to not only worry about that, but also these other types of values in terms of biodiversity, water quality, and one of the new stewardship type programs we're signing up to is essentially based around the fact that your main goal output is to leave your landscape in a better place when you're finished with it than when you started. So that involves a number of things, and carbon tends to only be a minor part of that.
Now John, you've also been quite a pioneer in cropping and grazing. You actually worked with the CSIRO back in the 90s on early programs to try and increase the fertility of your soil through regimes. Yeah,
that's right, Tim. We were lucky enough to be part of their program when they were looking at grazing crops and also harvesting them. At the time, that was thought of to be completely absurd.
And you've seen huge improvements in the fertility of the soil as a result of that, haven't you?
Well, we've learned to manage it. The livestock, in our system are a key part of increasing the fertility, cycling nutrients and those types of things. So for us, a cropping system without livestock wasn't going to work. And we were lucky enough, they've bred varieties that really suit our environment, and we have a very long environment here. We're about 850 metres above sea level where we are, so that enables us to sow our crops very early. We typically sow in February, and
you graze them a couple of times.
We can graze for about 4 to 5 months, and typically we get about between 4 and 6 tonne of dry matter off those crops, and we work on trying to achieve about 100 kilos of lamb per tonne of dry matter. So that means we're producing sort of 400 to 600 kilos of lamb per hectare off those dual purpose crops, and that's a very vital part of our system, because it turns a period of the year that used to be very low productivity into one that's now very high productivity. And now also that we're supplying lambs into a heavy US type market, that type of land use really is a win-win for us. And that 5 to 6 tonne of biomass grown, by and large, the livestock are used to recycle that through the soil. So it's not as if that marching all that organic matter out the gate. They're a vital tool to maintain that soil health and that biology in the paddock.
And they're building biology and they're building soil depth as a result of that as well.
Yes, so we're very focused on probably having shorter crop rotations, so only 2 or 3 years, and then say 5 to 6, 7 years worth of pasture rotation in behind that. And the aim of that is that we have typically low nitrogen use out of that system, so we're not pouring on heaps of synthetic fertiliser, and we're using the nitrogen build up in a paddock like we're looking at here we're using that as a key tool to make our cropping program very sustainable.
And as a result, you've lowered your reliance on urea. You don't use much urea anymore. Your nitrogen comes from your practices.
By and large, that's the aim. We still do use urea. Like we're targeting typically 4 tonne of canola, sort of 8 tonne of wheat. So we've got in that, and those enterprises are highly profitable because we've got the lamb in there on top of that as well. But you are marching with, in terms of the grain, you're marching nutrients out the gate. That's right. So you do need a little bit in there to maintain that.
So what would be your use per hectare of urea?
Typically would be maybe a couple of 100 kilos, 150 to 200 kilos that's on a 4 to 5 tonne canola crop. So if I think canola using sort of 80 units a tonne. So, but that canola crop in that paddock would only happen once out of a 10-year scenario.
So you're lowering the use of artificial fertilisers, you're increasing the soil biota, you're increasing the soil carbon, you're having good positive impacts on waterways around the farm because you don't have runoff of chemical into the waterways. You've decreased the amount of herbicides that you need to use because of your cropping and grazing. You've got some concerns now around the new ACCU schemes for carbon, and you're a little bit concerned that maybe we might take our eye off the ball if we don't consider some other things in our farming.
Yeah, for sure, and I think we've probably already seen some of that starting to play out. I think down your way you're seeing, viable dairy farms that have, varying land classes and different things growing across the landscapes, including native vegetation. We're seeing those types of businesses wiped out and turned into monoculture forestry regimes. So when the focus is purely on carbon, you forget about the rest of it.
So John, this is a forestry block, literally just over the fence from where we were.
Yep.
And you're a bit of a fan of forestry, aren't you? You find it's an efficient use of low quality land.
Yeah, well that's right, Tim. It's a very efficient use, and we can, as a whole community, we can get more of an output by using these less agricultural resources for forestry.
Because you wouldn't get 5 tonne a hectare of canola off here, would you?
No, for sure, and that's right. And that's if you're left to the free market regime. Forestry tends to end up in these sites like this that tend to be less productive for agriculture and far better for forestry. So that's what happens in the free market.
And there's a lower return per kilo off timber than there is, say, prime lamb. So it makes sense that timber would be grown on less valuable land.
For sure, that's right. And historically that's never been much different. Agricultural returns tend to outdo forest returns over time. But
just to give everyone an idea, B-double of timber going past you on the highway, how much would that be worth?
Well, out of this region, because our freight's so much, it's around $1,200 for the B-double load.
If you had a B-double of prime lambs going down the road past you, what would that be worth based on common market values?
Yeah, about 120,000.
That's a fair difference, isn't it?
It's a fair difference, but we can accommodate both industries.
Of course.
Just because our per tonne rate on forestry is far less, it just shows that we need to use our better arable land, our better higher quality assets for agriculture, and we can fit forestry in and around that. And we've actually got about 100 hectares earmarked to go to agroforestry.
Yourselves?
Down the track, that's right. We've got sections of our farm that are deemed to be not as productive for agriculture and actually potentially better used for forestry.
And it just shows, doesn't it, when you let the free market work, land values are commensurate with the return that you get for different crops, whether it be forestry or whether it be prime lambs off beautiful land. Those two land areas are going to be worth a different amount of money, aren't they? For
sure, that's right. And that encourages forestry to return to these sort of sites as well, because the cost of reverting this out back to agriculture is astronomical. So we need to be encouraging our regulations and our government rulings. We need to be encouraging forestry to return into these sites where they've proven productive.
And I suppose that's the point of today, isn't it? At the moment, that's not happening.
No, well, there's a lot of adverse effects that seem to be popping up, and they're popping up more regularly as time...
Specifically carbon credits.
Yeah, that's right, and we're seeing it, you're seeing it in southwest Victoria with timber plantations replacing dairy. You're seeing these things happening in the market that wouldn't normally happen.
So explain to me, why is it, you think, that timber plantations are popping up on land that was traditionally too expensive to grow timber plantations economically on? What are the cost drivers that are behind these decisions to plant out?
Yeah, well, it's probably the attractiveness of the car. They're not only adding a little bit of value, which is probably the idea of having a carbon revenue tacked onto an enterprise. They're probably trebling the turnover of some of these land uses. So that's why we're seeing a shift in, when we haven't seen much expansion for the last 10 years or so. Well, suddenly we are, and it's driven by these carbon revenues, but also the lure that has in terms of reining in capital to go into these forestry projects. I think it's important that when we're designing policies, we need to ensure that the product remains the driver and not just an excuse to
offset carbon emissions.
Correct. Yep.
Because the environment's about more than just carbon, isn't it? I mean, you've got to think about water, you've got to think about biota, you've got to think about the forest floor, you've got to think about a range of things, impact on native species of monocultures in plantations. You have some concerns around that as well?
Yeah, well, at the minute they're getting credited for all the biomass they grow in the forest. So
the trees and the soil?
And the leaves and everything else. So much of that, as most of us know, much of that just cycles in the landscape, as do our pastures and the like. So that's a cyclical process. But
you're saying that trees, if they're used in a carbon credit scheme, actually overvalue the land? Well,
the way they measure the carbon, the trees a significantly higher level of abatement, and that's partially true. But you know, in terms of soil carbon, you might be looking at half a tonne per hectare to 1.5 tonne per hectare of soil carbon.
Potential.
Yeah, which is, and to get ACCUs, you times that by about 3. So we're talking about 4 ACCUs a hectare. Mm-hmm. In terms of forestry, we're looking at rates sort of 20 to 40, even up to 40. So that's generated by computer-based modelling. It's not really based on measuring anything.
So good agriculture will get you 4 ACCUs?
Yep.
Planting trees will get you up to 30 ACCUs?
Correct, according to the models. Now, it's yet to be proven, but I'd suggest that those models are significantly overstating some of the levels of abatement. But it's a very easy investment model for a fund managers these types of things, because the model's guaranteeing your return, and forestry's reasonably, there's not a lot going on in terms of day-to-day management, so you can have the investment and be reasonably comfortable that's going to stay there.
So you can be a foreign investor and know that your investment block is just going to tick along and earn you these ACCUs without too much work and without too much labour involved.
That's right, but that's only for the next 25 years, of course. So the devil is in the detail always. The credit liability that they've sold in the market, well, they haven't sold it, but there's a value on that in the market that then goes against that land. So if you do choose to revert that land use in the future, you need to reverse out the credit liability, which may well be worth more than the land value is worth. So, and we saw it in the MIS years. You sort of have no planning in and around this. So you're having these other drivers in terms of tax back then and now carbon dominating the land use without really sitting back and taking stock of, well, hang on, what's going on here?
It's not a real product. There's nothing leaving the farm gate that's actually sold and used. It's just taking a liability from here and transferring it over there and getting paid in the middle.
Correct. And the problem for a little community like ours here is that all that revenue, all that transaction happens at far arm's length, and that revenue flows out of the community, not into it. So we're saying that, you know, you're seeing in New Zealand where these sort of types of schemes, for them it's resulted in large expansions of pine forest for carbon credits only. A lot of this forest, that forest asset's not used for timber production, just for carbon. But you're seeing communities devalued as they see the credits exported out, but they're left to deal with the aftermath of the land use. And also the fact that those land assets were once part of the community wealth, you know, owned locally, you know, people going to local schools, all that types of things. They're now, you know, probably owned by a pension fund in Canada or America or somewhere like that.
So John, we're back on your beautiful farm. It's not all doom and gloom. You actually reckon that there's some fantastic opportunities with this carbon emission scheme?
Well, not so much with the carbon emission scheme, but the funding source. So we have a once in a multi-generational opportunity that we've got a source of funding that's coming out of the decarbonisation of the economy, and by the top 100 emitters having to write out a cheque for their emissions unless they can reduce their emissions, of which most of them can't. So, you know, that revenue source is there. Now, farmers like us, we've probably got 5-10% of our landscape that we'd love to do in strategic type tree planting projects. Now,
which would have a carbon benefit.
part of that would have a carbon benefit.
But it's a whole landscape approach, isn't it?
That's right. So we're not solely focused on that. And if we do these things sensibly in land care, large scale land care type projects across, small scale on each farm, but across a very large area, each farmer getting a bit of this action, you're going to have net win-win outcomes going forward.
So we've already got institutions like Landcare in place to deliver outcomes that are whole landscape focused, that would be carbon positive and would also sort out water, sort out biota, sort out indigenous fauna and create a whole host of positive outcomes for farmers. You're saying let's use this money to actually do good in the landscape rather than just offset an emission.
That's right.
And create a profit for an offshore entity.
Yeah, unfortunately we're already a fair way down this carbon trading, stream. So you can argue the toss of whether that's a good idea or not. I'd suggest a carbon tax is probably better, and then do things in a far more sensible way by using that revenue strategically in the landscape, that we can look back in, 10, 50, 60 years time and say, geez, we did a good smart thing with that once an opportunity time we had to use that money. Whereas at the minute, there's definitely going to be projects popping up around the place that we're going to scratch our heads in 10, 15 years time and say, why the hell did we ever do that?
John, thank you very much for your time, mate. It's always good to talk to rational, sensible people, particularly those on the coalface that are actually seeing within their local community the effects of legislation and the effects of policy.
Great, thanks Tim, and thanks for your interest.
Guys, don't forget, if you like this sort of content and you're interested in topics like this, hit the subscribe button and there'll be more next week.